percussive pendu. Sitôt qu'on le touche, il résonne. De Bérangère. During the whole of a dull, dark, and soundless day in the autumn of the year, when the clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens, I had been passing alone, on horseback, through a singularly dreary tract of country, and at length found myself, as the shades of the evening drew on, within view of the melancholy house of Usher. I know not how it was, but with the first glimpse of the building, a sense of insufferable gloom pervaded my spirit.
So the uses of setting. The uses of setting. Referential, atmospheric, symbolic. Let's start with the referential, building a bridge between the story plot and the world to which it refers and is about. With regard to setting, Kennedy and the rest are minimalist. Setting is, quote, the time and place of a literary work. What about the Norton? A bit more expansive. The Norton editors describe setting as the element of the story that, quote, generates the conflicts, defines the characters, and gives the story purpose and meaning. So much so that there would be little, if any, story left of all the details somehow transported to a different time, place, and social milieu. That's a quote from the Norton. Setting is functional. Time, place, and social milieu matter, and setting situates the story in a time, a place, a social milieu. The referential use of setting can be described in this way, I think, rather cogently. The husband in the story that so many of you decided to write about, Gilman's story, the husband we find is a physician, okay? One target of the story, the plot, the institution of medicine as practiced at this time and in this place. But as a few of you noted in passing, Gilman's setting is, quote, a colonial mansion, a hereditary estate in which wealthy upper class people live. Not a place or social milieu usually associated with physicians who these days make all kinds of money, right? But who at that time were not economically, well, they were economically well off, but not so socially elite that they would be owners of hereditary estates. So you see how setting points to purpose and meaning. One purpose of the story could be to characterize the lives of rich folks. He's a doctor, after all, living on an estate that's been, quote, secured, which is a really interesting word, during a very specific post-colonial era, the late 1800s, as several of you noted. The story is not just about the medical profession then. It's also about people who are fairly well off, and perhaps newly so, newly well off. Keep reading. Michaela speaks for several when she asserts that, quote, the yellow wallpaper symbolizes the patriarchal constraints and societal expectations placed on women during this time period, especially well-off women, I would add, the wives of, for example, rich doctors. Lance claims that, quote, the wallpaper's oppressive presence symbolizes the damaging effects of patriarchal norms on women's autonomy and mental well-being, highlighting the struggle for liberation from oppressive societal constraints. It's not just a matter of John's being a bad husband then, his being an insensitive individual. He is a person of a certain gender and upbringing. But to return to the question of class, as in social class, which we were talking about up above, Denise, a student in a different section, spies another layer. Quote, the narrator states that it is not often that ordinary people like her and her husband acquire homes like this. Obviously, there's some tradition of having a colonial mansion, but at the same time, the description of it makes it seem like the home itself presents a bad omen. Gilman's setting, it's like a haunted house. Gilman's setting helps indicate the doctor's social aspiration. He is an ordinary person who has delightedly bought a mansion, which turns out to be a haunted house, or rather secured one, quote, for the summer, an ancestral mansion, and one that makes the narrator, quote, think of English places that you read about. John, we may infer, is a member of the nouveau riche. He's a social climber, and his self-confessed, quote, ordinary wife is along for the ride. A second use of setting, atmospheric. as opposed to referential. This is pretty close to symbolic because it does have a symbolic dimension, but it's not identical. The atmospheric use of setting establishes mood. It creates an emotional weather, so to speak, through which the characters will be making their ways. Characters acknowledge it now and then, try to ignore it or defy it, implicitly if not explicitly, and even come to discover it as a truth that has thus far eluded them. A famous example of such mood setting. Quote, "It was a dark and stormy night." You've heard that before. But here's a better one. During the whole of a dull, dark, and soundless day in the autumn of the year, when the clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens, I had been passing alone, on horseback, through a singularly dreary tract of country, and at length found myself, as the shades of the evening drew on, within view of the melancholy house of Usher. I know not how it was, but with the first glimpse of the building, a sense of insufferable gloom pervaded my spirit. Now it goes on, and I'm going to let you read through the rest of this wonderful paragraph in the very beginning of an Edgar Allan Poe story. Now you read one, what was that, last week, right? Which was the Cask of Amontillado, and this is The Fall of the House of Usher, which is, I think, even more famous, anthologized all over the place, and just a very wonderful story. It also offers an absolutely wonderful example of an atmospheric use of setting here at the very opening. I don't think it even needs to be described in great detail by me or even explained when you see what's happening. We have a mood that is set by way of the world around which this traveler is traveling and into which he is passing. I have been passing alone on horseback through a singularly dreary tract of country during the whole of a dull, dark, and soundless day in the autumn of the year. I mean, it hits all the boxes, doesn't it? Checks all the boxes and hits all the targets for creating this sense of, quote, insufferable gloom, perhaps in the reader, as well as in the spirit of the traveler. Now, a few of you got interested in this, again, in the context of Gilman's story. As Asia asserted, the setting sets a tone for us readers. Tone is a lot like mood. The setting takes place in the narrator's home when she is confined to the one room with yellow wallpaper. This room, to her, is as a prison. This paper looks to me as if it knew, this is something said by the main character, what a vicious influence it had. I believe, as she continues, that it reflects the state of her mental health overall, because even in her own home, she feels like she's a prisoner. Alex agrees. Gilman's, quote, setting tells the story. I like that phrase. Alex, like that a lot. The character is surrounded by this terrible yellow wallpaper, which functions in this story to help tell the story. It gives us a sense of the mood of the story and the mood of the main character. The color is repellent, almost revolting. This is a quote, a smoldering, unclean yellow, strangely faded by the slow-turning sunlight. It is a dull yet lurid orange in some places, a sickly sulfur tint in others. Note, Alex urges, how sad and dull the room is. Note as well the main character herself and how sad and dull she is. So what about, by contrast, the symbolic use of setting? Well, this one's pretty clear, is it not? If you understand anything about symbolism, right? And I know you read about that for this week. Authors manipulate elements of setting, not just in order to create social and historical reference points and relevancies, that's a referential use, and not just in order to establish an emotional mood or tone, which they might wish to do for any number of characterological reasons, for reasons of establishing a particular character's attitude, feeling, mood, spirit, though also for other reasons, sometimes also, or even referential ones, right? That you can do that atmospheric business that we talked about in the last plate, but also a third possible use and a third possible motive of those who create settings. It's not just the referential and the atmospheric, but also in order to create suggestive correspondences by means of which, symbols, by means of which to advance the plot and clarify or at least indicate the theme. Now, all of that is a lot of abstract language. Let's get into some examples in Gilman. What about atmospherics in Gilman? We've already been through those, haven't we? As we have already intuited, perhaps, the narrator's, quote, disgust and loathing of her situation, or established her dullness. Okay, as and something worse than dullness, right? As we were talking about in the last plate. The disgust and loathing of her situation, or disgust with loathing of her situation, are established early on, even as the wallpaper is hung up, as it were, before the reader. It's repellent, almost revolting, a smoldering, unclean yellow. So what's the difference then, right? Well, the difference is that between a symbolic, that we want to use that term, we want to say that's a symbolic use of setting as opposed to it just merely an atmospheric use. I would argue that in those moments when we say, oh, look, that's symbolic, that's, overtly and directly symbolic as opposed to this more indirect atmospheric, just think about it. It's in the atmosphere, the meaning is just up there kind of or around there or whatnot. Symbolic is where, well, you'll see here in a moment, it's something that's more specific and something where there's a lot of attention paid to it. Let me read to you what I've written on it here. Setting becomes symbolic when its elements, these atmospheric elements, escape the atmospheric background to become the focus in their own right. I'm going to pause for a moment. Do you get that? But you can almost imagine that one of those clouds that are hanging very low in the sky, establishing a mood for the traveler in The Fall of the House of Usher from the last play. If you can imagine one of the clouds, he suddenly started paying very close attention to it, and it became an item picked out of the atmospheric background and on which he focused, and it seemed to carry a lot of meaning. And he was doing something with that cloud that told us something about him, affording it a meaning, embodying it, okay, or imbuing it with a significance that struck us as very, very odd and striking. Okay, then I think we'd be in the presence of this third sort of use of setting, this third motive of those who set. The wallpaper works atmospherically, as we saw in the last play. It works referentially. Is it a rich person's wall covering? It also works symbolically. Abrams Harfam identifies symbol as a word or phrase that signifies an object or event, which in turn signifies something, or suggests a range of reference beyond itself. I want to get into just the idea, okay, well, like the thing, the idea of color, or the thing of color, okay, this basic pigment of irreducible pigment of color. Here, the very color seems to have a certain significance when we think of the word yellow, right? The word red has a certain significance that we, I bet we could brainstorm and figure out what we might want to say that significance was. We could certainly say that about white. We could say it about gold, golden. For yellow, a feature or quality of an object, the wallpaper in this case, it's a traditional symbol, just as maybe you could say white is. White is a symbol of purity, right? Gold is a symbol of worth or value. Think, when we say, oh, I'm golden, or you're golden, we know what that means. Think of the story we would have. Here's a good way of testing just how effectual this color, you could just manipulate in color, something that basic can be as a symbolic use of setting. Imagine the title of the story being the golden wallpaper, okay, as opposed to the yellow wallpaper. I think you'd expect something very different, wouldn't you? And there's this novel by Henry James called The Golden Ball. Imagine calling it the Yellow Ball. And Doris Lessing wrote a book called The Golden Notebook, right? As opposed to the purple one, or working with the color purple. What about Alice Walker's The Color Yellow as opposed to the color purple? Something would be very, very different about these works. Think of yellow as opposed to golden or white, as I suggested a moment ago. One thing we know about yellow, it's not white or gold. It could be, used to be white, okay? And it yellowed, right? Where we would see yellow as a symbol of, well, it suggests something spoiled or faded, stale at the very least, something unwholesome, smoldering, unclean, which is from the story. This is a more precise significance beyond its vague, atmospheric suggestion of disgust and loathing, if you see what I'm saying. Moreover, the yellow of the wallpaper is more than a means of establishing an emotional atmospheric backdrop. It is of interest in its own right. There is nothing retiring about it, rhetorically speaking. Moving into the foreground, it calls attention to itself. Indeed, she, the narrator, becomes fascinated by it, as if trying to understand it. We're talking about the color, right? Textures too, but the color. The narrator herself calls attention to the color and its significance, its variations in tone and what they might mean. It is a dull, several of you quoted this, it is a dull yet lurid orange in some places, a sickly sulfur tint in others. Bridget, for example, quote, the color of the wallpaper reminds me of gold, which could also symbolize a sort of gilded cage, right? She isn't truly being held against her will, but with enough isolation and delusions that the narrator goes mad and obsesses over the wallpaper. You'll see that to call a cage a golden cage, a gilded cage, is not to establish an atmosphere, but to, in fact, turn the room that is the gilded cage, the golden cage, into something. right? To suggest something about it that is beyond the thing itself. And that's what we call the symbolic use, very specific symbolic use of setting. Jasmine, quote, the room described as an asylum symbolizes a prison to the narrator. The yellow wallpaper itself almost symbolizes the narrator and her mental state as the story progresses. The narrator describes the yellow wallpaper as dull. And notice a student from a previous semester notes the deeply personal quality of the symbol. Well, noting yellow is usually a happy color. This is the narrator's personal symbol. It does not bring joy. It invites her deeper to madness. The notion of a personal symbol is interesting. Gilman exploits the traditional meanings associated with the color yellow, but gives them, or has her narrator give them, a personal twist. Personal inflection. Certainly the narrator herself would agree. As she exclaims, there are things in that paper, the wallpaper, the yellow wallpaper, which nobody knows but me or ever will. And it's one of the mysteries of the story, what to make of the yellow wallpaper, what she makes of the yellow wallpaper when all is said and done. I think you could continue to have that conversation for a good long time before you felt that you'd really gotten to the bottom of it. The narrator herself insists on the personal meaning of that wallpaper, and in so doing, she shows setting, contributing to characterization. Okay, referential, atmospheric, symbolic. Symbolic 1, symbolic 2. Here's a second symbolic exploration, shall we say, of the wallpaper. In this case, we're not talking about the yellow. What I'm hoping to do is explore and coordinate several of your insights into what else it is about this wallpaper that is exploited for symbolic purposes as setting by the author. And here we begin to see the suggestive complexity of Gilman's symbolism, which is not limited to the color yellow. She doesn't just say, the main character, oh, I had yellow wallpaper, it was really disgusting, and made me kind of feel weird. That would be pretty atmospheric, wouldn't it? No, the wallpaper that is colored yellow, taken as a whole, okay, right? Not limited to that paper, but to what's in the paper, not just the color of the paper, the fact that it's paper, that it's in a house, that it's in a certain room. All of these things can be used symbolically as elements of setting, right, to advance the aims of the story. In this case, the house, the room, the furniture, and of course the wallpaper, all of these are symbols. Adriana, quote, the symbols include the estate, garden. See, you guys, I'm just going by you guys. I think you're right. The symbols include the estate, the garden, the yellow wallpaper, the journal, and the bed nailed to the floor. All symbolize our main character. Quote, the setting of the estate itself is enclosed, walled off from the rest of the world, and confining our narrator, who's isolated within the grounds of the estate. The gardens are manicured with shapes and patterns, fashioned in a purposeful arrangement which evokes further internment, suggests further internment of our main character. She's, enclosed within an enclosure. And it's almost like a maze out of which she would have to find herself. I think that's very nicely noted, Adriana, right? Eventually, the interior of the home, before we get to the symbolic, eventually the interior of the home, right? Explicitly the nursery with its yellow wallpaper transforms into a jail. Now, Lance concurs, quote, the room with the yellow wallpaper that becomes the focal point of symbolism. Yes, even before we get to the symbolic wallpaper, we confront the symbolic enclosing structure of the room. Another student, quote, note how the room in question was previously a nursery and playroom, indicating it was designed for children, not adults. This, the yellow narrators being placed in there, can be seen as a reflection of how women were infantilized and not taken seriously during this time period. Notice that little touch of the referential there at the very end with that mention of time period. A, let's call this student from another section, notes how, quote, the rings and things on the walls of the nursery can represent chains. C, also from that other section, the barred window is obvious prison symbolism, but could the rings and things on the walls symbolize chains and shackles? The narrator also mentions that the bed is nailed down and that there's a gate at the head of the stairs. S notes how the furniture, for example, the bed mentioned by C, carries ominous symbolic weight. And you will recall that the narrator misses her old childhood chair that always seemed like a strong friend. So there's a lot of this going on inside that room, even beyond the wallpaper itself, right? Even beyond the color of the wallpaper. And it is time to talk about the other aspects of the wallpaper beyond just the simple fact that it's a yellow color and that she's very interested in exploring its yellowness. She's also very interested in exploring its other dimensions, right, as many of you noticed. And of course, many of you explore the same symbolic resonance when discussing the wallpaper in particular, and its pattern, more particularly yet. Jay, student in another section, in the moonlight, the narrator can see bars in the wallpaper with a woman trapped behind them. All by moonlight, it becomes bars, the outside pattern, I mean. That's a quote from the story. And the woman behind it as plain as can be. K, quote, she starts to see a woman, the main character starts to see a woman trapped behind the pattern. R, the wallpaper's chaotic pattern, see all this interest in the pattern of the wallpaper. The wallpaper's chaotic pattern mirrors the main character's mental disarray as she descends into madness. Disarray at times, but also insight, accuracy of intuition, at least potentially. The wallpaper offers her a chance, does it not? Don't we feel it's sort of vaguely healthy for her to be focused upon it? Although we wonder, as descending into madness and all that, or is the wallpaper a place maybe where you could find equipoise and be rescued from madness, right? It's an interesting issue that I think crops up as the story goes along. The wallpaper offers her a chance then, if only she can see it as such, if only she can read it right, perhaps, and read in it the truth about her situation. The wallpaper has an anxious feel about it that prompts distress. Setting can occasionally be an actor in the plot, one of you argued, one which often prompts characters' actions. One can imagine the narrators projecting on to the setting, in this case the wallpaper, as well as the patterns within it, her inner hurt. And as it were, this being something of a horror story, the wallpaper playing along. The question arises, is it on her side or not? Is it her enemy, this wallpaper, the opposite of her old chair? It's a good question, isn't it? Or is it somehow, conceivably, eventually, itself a friend? Nathan, quote, by the end of it, the story, she seems obsessed with it, imagining things that would seemingly be impossible. So he's really wondering, Nathan is. K, student in another section, it symbolizes her own feelings of being trapped. But again, does that symbol prove liberating or the reverse somehow? Lance, quote, as the story progresses, the wallpaper transforms into a living entity that seems to entrap the narrator within its pattern. It doesn't sound like it's really helpful, does it? Mirroring her own entrapment. Now that's interesting. Within the confines of her domestic life and societal expectations, right? That mirroring, if she can look at the wallpaper and see it as a mirror of her own situation, as opposed to perhaps disappearing into what is a hall of mirrors, I guess, a kind of fun house, a house of horrors, really. Does she see the mirroring? Does she see, as S puts it, quote, that she has been likely seeing herself all along, and that the truth about herself has been and is available in that revelatory mirror of the walls? See, she's got to see that for the wallpaper to function as a salutary presence, as a helpful presence. That could be potentially liberating if she sees it that way. Or does she see just another victim, the woman in the wall who's also struggling to get out, the sight of whom is not particularly reassuring? Can't you imagine it like you see the woman in the wall trying to get out, she can't, right? And you figure, okay, I can't either, it's hopeless. That wouldn't be good. Or does she see when she looks at the woman in the wall? There are a couple of suggestions of this, and you guys are interested in them. Another victimizer, not another victim, a taunting figure that keeps her locked away. As Jasmine quotes, the woman in the wallpaper can seem vaguely threatening. The front pattern does move, she's quoting, and no wonder the woman behind shakes it. Well, the ending rather, is a satisfying one, I would argue, and I think some of you would agree, only if, as C puts it, quote, the further her mental state declines, the more she begins to believe that the woman trapped up behind the pattern of the wallpaper is indeed she herself, and that to free herself, she must tear it down. She must be done with it, I'm about to tell you, I'm about to suggest. Naya notes that the main character, quote, pulls down the wallpaper because the woman wants to come out of the wallpaper. Okay, she seems to be identifying with a woman trapped. That's so far so good. She's doing that. Nathan, quote, she sees part of herself in the wallpaper, but failing to see that there really is no woman in the wall, that the woman trapped, seemingly trapped in the wall, is simply a projection of her own fear, right? Failing, that is, to read the wallpaper is indeed but a mirror. The woman is a mirror image. That's not so good. Because what do? You then try to free her madly, tearing at the wallpaper, instead of freeing yourself, right? That does not strike me as a good ending if you're just madly ripping at the wallpaper. Instead of doing what? Well, the better ending of the story would have her, wouldn't it? Having looked hard in the mirror, wouldn't it have her look away, stop tearing at the paper, and leave the room? That's the way to get the woman out of the wall. As Parker asserts, over the course of the story, she becomes, quote, consumed by the images she sees or thinks she sees within the wallpaper. In the end, she needs to escape them.
Indeed, wait until we get to Kafka. You don't have to wait long. Onward, inward. You're about to read another story about withdrawal, madness, confinement, art and the imagination or aesthetic impulse, as we will see. Not something we talk that much about. That you could argue that there's a touch of the artist about that narrator of Gilman's story. And we will certainly see that that is the case for Gregor Samsa, who is the hero of Kafka's The Metamorphosis, and who suffers the presence of his family, much as the narrator of Gilman's story suffers the presence of hers. As you will see, and this is one of the first things I would like you to do as you begin reading for next week, is note just how close the scenario is to that conjured by Gilman. This time not a wife and a mother, but a son.